Hey, how's it going? It's good to see you. Well, I can't see you. Or. Anyway, here's what we're doing. Just a reminder, we are working through the letter of James and we started last week. And you'll hopefully remember that I said the reason that I want to start looking at the book of James is because I kind of felt God say to us, listen, it's time to put our faith back in action again. We all kind of said that we were floating around like boats in a harbour, not necessarily putting into action the things that Jesus calls us to do as believers. And so the letter of James is a real challenge to do that. And remember what I said was that he takes his information that he's putting across to us from the teachings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and 7, but also because, well, he was Jesus's half-brother. So when he was wrestling with Jesus as his brother and all that kind of stuff and hanging out, well, he knew the things that Jesus felt was important. So this letter comes from a real source of wisdom. Last week, the first section is a real challenge to us because James talks about whenever we are going through struggles and we're going through trials, that's okay, not that it feels good, but actually what it does is that it increases our faith and it helps us in our faith because when we go through tough times and struggles, it makes our faith more mature and stronger, and therefore good things happen as a result of that. So James starts in this place where he says, look, hard times and tough times, they're going to come. Just because you become a Christian and a believer doesn't mean like we open our Bibles and out comes this get out of tough times free card. That's not how it works. And he's saying a similar thing here in the next section. And he's talking about temptation. We're going to look at what James says about temptation. And the fact that he's talking to us about that means that, well, whenever we become believers doesn't mean that temptation then stops when we put our faith and our trust in Jesus. In fact, I think we can say it's probably going to get a little bit harder. What I want to do, though, is I want to look at a video clip that made me think about this. It's a video clip from Friends. It makes me laugh, but also it made me think about what James is talking about whenever he talks about temptation. So let's have a quick look at this.
What are these? Oh, just some pictures I made and hung up. Thought they'd brighten up the place. They do, don't you think? Ow! No! I know there's no hole there. I just really like that picture. Oh my God, look at this! Okay, but there is a wire back there. I mean, that switch is connected to something. I don't care. The wires have come loose in your head. I just thought if I could follow the wire, I could find out what it did. And did you? No. Disappears back there behind that baseboard. For a minute there, I thought it went downstairs. But it didn't. Say hello to Mrs. Katrakis.
Oh my God.
Hello, darling.
Hello, Mrs. Katrakis.
All right. The super couldn't figure out what it did. The $200 an hour electrician couldn't figure out what it did. I've had 7 pretty serious shocks. I officially give up.
Thank God.
Guess Joey was right. It does nothing.
See? I'm doing it. I am totally doing it.
Who doesn't love a bit of Friends? Well, apart from Ben. Ben told me earlier he doesn't watch Friends. What's that about, Ben?
Okay.
Yeah, you should be. Anyway, clip makes me laugh. Ultimately what happens in that clip is there's this switch, but Monica tries to find where the lead comes from. She can't find where this lead comes from at all. She punches holes in the wall, she punches holes in the floor, trying to find where this lead comes from that goes to the switch. Let's read the next part of James and I'll explain why this clip came to my mind in and around this piece of scripture. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So the reason that clip from Friends came to my attention was because, well, Monica's looking for the source of where that wire comes from. She looks everywhere to see where that wire is coming from. And so the reason that comes to my mind is because James is answering this question of where is the source of our temptation? Where does temptation come from? And the first thing he says is that, look, temptation doesn't come from God. Now, the reason that he says that must make me think that people must come to the conclusion in their own minds that God tempts us. Or perhaps they look in another direction and kind of think, well, temptation comes from there. And people can so often be looking around to be like, well, why do I get tempted? Where do I get tempted from? Because temptation is a difficult thing about being a believer. And so James here is kind of saying, listen, don't get mistaken here. Temptation doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from him. And what he says is that temptation comes from us. Temptation comes because, well, we get drawn towards things that, well, they're not good for us. They pull us away from God. And we get tempted towards those things because, well, inside that we have a natural pull towards those things because we're naturally just not inclined to 100% go after the right things. And so the source of our temptation actually is us. Now, don't get me wrong. We are forgiven for the consequences of giving in to temptation, which is sin. That's not what he's saying here. But actually what he's saying is that don't go to God and be like, you're the reason why I get tempted. Don't go to another kind of thing and say, well, that's the reason why I get tempted. The reason that we get tempted is because, well, because we get drawn towards those things because of how we are. So James is saying, look, we are prone to be lured by things that aren't good. We are prone to be wandering towards things that aren't good for us. But what he's saying is, he says, listen, don't blame God. And in fact, what he is saying is, he says that, listen, this comes from us. And listen, I've had conversations with people all the time who say, oh, it'd be so much easier if I don't get tempted. Well, yeah, of course it would. But is that likely? No. Is it helpful to think that way? No. Like, it's kind of like thinking to myself, oh, it would be so much easier if somebody would just do this essay for me. But that's not going to happen. Well, unless you were to pay somebody, which is probably a really good idea, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So I think we've got to change our thinking towards these things. We've got to be like, okay, I'm going to get tempted towards things which pull me away from God because I'm human. I'm going to get tempted because I am who I am. And so if we start to expect temptation and not blame it on God or blame it on other things and just be like, it's part of my human condition that I'm going to get tempted, I think that will be helpful. Now, what I'm not saying here is that we give in to temptation, because listen, what James then says as a result is that when we give in to the things that we're tempted by, well, that leads us to sin. And then he uses this metaphor of that, well, that causes us to die. Now, we don't actually die, right? I mean, I have done stuff wrong today. I'm still here. I'm not dead. But actually, when he talks about death, he talks about, well, it breaks our relationship with God. So I'm not saying that we give in to our temptation, not at all. That's what James is saying, is that don't do that. But I think we need to change our mentality and be like, okay, I'm going to get tempted. It's going to come. But let's stop blaming God. Let's not blame other things. And let's be accepting of the fact that actually I'll get tempted because that's part of being human. So James is saying, look, we're going to get tempted. It doesn't come from God. And when we give in to temptation, it leads to sin, which leads to separation from God. And I think we've all experienced that, right? When we know we're not living right, we feel distance from God. So he says this temptation doesn't come from him, it comes from us. But here's what does come from God. James offers us this truth about what God does give to us. He doesn't give us temptation, but here's what he does give. He says, don't be deceived, brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth. So what he's saying here is that our sin leads to death, but when he talks about this birth that we get from the word of truth, that's just a fancy way of calling Jesus by his name. He was known as the Word, and he is true. So he says that actually what we do get from God is birth. So when we sin, when we mess up, that leads to this breaking of our relationship with God. But when we have our trust in Jesus, it gives us new life, because that's where grace and forgiveness comes from. And so that is what he does give to us. He doesn't give us temptation, but he gives us grace and life for whenever we do mess up. So let's summarize this little piece of scripture that we've looked at. James says tough times are going to come. It's not going to stop just because you put your trust in Jesus. He says we're going to get tempted. That's not going to stop just because we've put our trust in Jesus. But he also indicates that we'll go looking, blaming everybody else and even blaming God for the reasons we get tempted, when really we just get tempted because that's part of our human condition. And maybe we've got to accept that we're going to get tempted and not blame God for the things that are tough, that tempt us, but accept the fact we get tempted. Now that doesn't mean we give in. No, we're supposed to live lives that are separate and holy, but also understand that when we do give in, well, it destroys our relationship with God a little bit. However, there's a vaccine. No, not that kind of vaccine. But there's a vaccine, there's something that helps us out that whenever we do that, and it's Jesus. We get new life through him, and he forgives us for what we do. And so James is saying, look, don't think that bad stuff comes from God. Don't think that, because it doesn't. Good things come from the Father of the heavenly lights. And when we give in to temptation and we sin, we get new life in him when we put our trust in him. So listen, James is saying, temptation's going to come your way. It is. Don't blame God. Maybe we just got to accept it and know it more. It's not a call to give in, but it's also a call to know that, well, hey, there's new life in Jesus and forgiveness in him. So we'll see you back in the main room, and we'll get into our breakout rooms, and we'll just discuss this and pull this apart a little bit more. See you back in there.